Welcome to a podcast celebrating Scottish culture and entertainment, which is here to sing the praises of books, films, comedy, music, theatre, exhibitions, telly, poetry and all that jazz. I'm Nicola Meighan. I'm an arts writer and broadcaster, and I'll give you the lowdown on what's coming up, what's happening now, what came before and what we love, which is to say that every week I'm here to give you a kick up the arts. I'm joined every Thursday by brilliant guests in art spaces around the country, but also once a month on a Friday evening. And this is the first one. There's a bonus episode called A Kick Up the Arts, All Back to Mine. It'll see a special guest giving us a virtual night in round at theirs. They're going to choose a Scottish album to play us, a Scottish film to show us, and a Scottish book for some bedtime reading. And we will chat about all of that. They might even chuck in a snack or two. The first of these is here right now, and it's thanks to the excellent Chris Brookmyre, who's just picked up the McIlvanney Prize for Crime Fiction Book of the Year for the second time for his latest novel, The Cracked Mirror. It's equal parts cosy village murder mystery, fired up 80s LA cop thriller, an affectionate upending of our expectations at every turn. We recorded this at Stirling's Vinyl Paradise Europa Music during the fab crime writing festival Bloody Scotland, and Chris and I were perched on stepladders at the back of the heaving record crate, so you might hear some creaking, you might clock a fly buzzing, and you might even note that Chris and I almost come to blows over the loot section. I mean, you can't blame us. First of all, I know I just said this to you, but I'm going to congratulate you again on the McIlvanney Prize. We're here in Stirling. What was it like on Friday night?
Oh, it was very emotional.
Yeah.
I mean, these things you spend all day nervous and anxious about it, and more so because at a festival you know that there's people there who know, and they're having to be poker faced to you, and in some cases all day, you know, because Marissa, my wife, and I we were doing loose ends first thing in the morning, and people from the festival that I knew the result were around, and you're like, you know, you're trying to work out from just their eye contact or whatever. So all day, and then even more ramping up is you're with the other nominees, and you're all gathered, and everybody's kind of trying to be mutually supportive, but everybody kind of withdraws into themselves a wee bit. And the room was really busy, and then they announced it, and I felt, you know, it's like Val McDermott and Abir Mukherjee. I'm very close to the two of them, and you kind of. So we'd have a wee kind of hug and then up onto the stage. But I think because I put so much into this book, it meant a great deal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You had said, I'd noticed you'd put on Twitter or whatever we call it these days online, that you feel that The Cracked Mirror is what you would actually identify as being your best book. What is it about it? I mean, obviously we'll delve into it a little bit, but the entire concept and construct is one thing. But it's good that you could distance yourself from it really this early on and say, yeah, I'm really... I feel I got what I wanted to do here. Yeah,
the weird thing is I've written books that were more sort of ideologically driven, or that were about more important things, or that were about things personal to me. In a way, it's a book about crime fiction. It's about a relationship with story in general. Mm-hmm. So maybe it's that meant a lot to me. You know, maybe it's also that I realised I'd created something that wasn't driven by whether it was ideology or some sort of personal peccadillos. It was just me creating something that I thought was a great entertainment. Yeah. So I think maybe that was what added to a sense of accomplishment about it. Yeah. More that I think we realised, my God, I actually pulled this off. You know, I created this, because I remember thinking, perhaps the reason it gave me distance, but I remember thinking, if someone else had written this, I'd be really jealous. Okay,
that's a really good way of recording it and your response to it, isn't it? Going, I'd be raging if someone else got here first.
Yeah.
Because it is one of these things, when you read it, you think, of course, these really, really ostensibly very, very different characters who are both very familiar to us if we are a lover of crime fiction. The cosy, interfering and very curious older woman in a small village, and of course your kind of hard-boiled LA cop. But to bring them both together, I mean, were there points where you were like, what have I done here? Rod for your own back with these different worlds and voices.
Frequently. I mean, I think that it was like the book's great strength is also its great burden for me. And that I think early on I realised I couldn't just have a kind of pastiche of these things. Mm-hmm. I had to do justice to both subgenres. I had to write in the style of the cosy, and the style of a more sort of hard-boiled or evoking 80s action movies as well, but I had to do it in a way that if someone had to pick this up and didn't see the cover, they could plausibly think this was from one of those genres, because otherwise it would just, it's one of those that had to be whole arsed, shall we say?
It's so true.
And that was, and it did make me feel, as you say, a rod from one back. It was more like all the time I couldn't let my guard down. I couldn't coast at any point. Sometimes, especially writing series, you know your character quite well, and you know how your character will respond in a situation. You know their voice. In this case, I had to think very carefully all the time. How does this sound? And then when the two of them are together, there was Harry and Penny and once they sort of team up, or even they're forced together, you then have to make decisions about, well, which one will I make this chapter about, or whose point of view will it be this time? Because whose voice therefore is narrating. You've got both voices in there when they're talking, but it's about their impressions of each other, and that you have to anticipate, and sometimes you can't get it right. And I would go back and think, actually, this chapter I realise has to be from Johnny's point of view, and have to rewrite it. And you maybe have to sacrifice a wee thought that Penny had that would have been really funny, or that shed light on something. But it was a constant balancing act.
You're constantly in a state of high alert as well.
Yeah,
you can't let your guard down.
I think that's it, for whatever reason. Also, when you've got a really good idea, you maybe set the bar high for yourself, so you're constantly thinking, is this good enough?
Yeah.
Whereas there's other stories that are less demanding of you.
Yeah, exactly. So we're sat here in Europa Music in Stirling in the back room. This is quite something. Do you want to describe what you can see as we're sat on the step ladders here chatting at the back?
Well, it is kind of beyond Aladdin's cave in terms of vinyl. And I don't think I've ever been in a room with quite so much in the way of vinyl.
Yeah.
And vinyl albums stuck to the ceiling, which just looks fantastic. It's more that the categorisation is what brings home how much there is here. It's not bands A to Z. It starts 60s A to Z, then 70s A to Z, then you get jazz.
I've just
soundtracks, Scottish comedy.
Here's a lute section.
I've never been in a shop that's actually got a lute subsection, a Robert Burns section.
I've got the accordions here, gospel. There you go.
Bill Barclay.
Viva Dunbar.
Oh my goodness.
We're in the kind of Scottish folk
There's actually an album here called Miscellaneous Dross. that's the name of the album. A Humorous Look at Scotland by Bill.
I don't know. Bill
Rice, is that?
Could be, yeah. Oh, that's going to...
I've started now.
Highland Voyage, I know. Well, listen, let's speak about another album, because what we're wanting to do here is kind of get the sense that it's maybe a Friday night. We've gate crashed either your kitchen or your living room. You can decide where that is. And you're going to play some music, Scottish music. And that can be as loosely Scottish as you like. And then a film. And then we'll get some bedtime reading. So we'll talk about the film and the book later. But first of all, what record are you putting on the turntable? Guaranteed it's in here, by the way. I've brought my own copy, but I tell you there'll be at least one in Europa's shelves.
I would put money on there being possibly 3 or 4.
Yeah.
Not just copies, but with different covers.
Well, quite.
Because when it first came out, I think the green cover was the most common, but there was variant, a blue cover and a red cover. The album was The Crossing by Big Country.
When did you first hear it, or encounter Big Country even?
Well, the thing is, I have to kind of preface this. My real musical first love was the Skids.
Okay, yeah.
So I remember being a kid listening, watching Top of the Pops, and it was, in primary school, I was into my music. I liked Top of the Pops, but there was just one night something came on and it just lit me up, and it was Into the Valley.
Oh wow! Okay.
And so I think it was one of the first singles that I bought with my own money, with pocket money. And then I remember waiting when you had very little as a kid. You didn't always have the wherewithal to buy stuff. You'd go to the local record shop and fetishise what was in the window. I remember fetishising that they had Scared to Dance, the first Skids album, but I never got around to buying that, or it wasn't something I asked for my birthday or something. Yeah. So the first one I asked for was actually Days in Europa.
Okay, all
appropriately,
right.
Days in Europa.
Here we are.
Which is an album I still listen to a lot. And then there was the Absolute Game was the next album, and then the Skids broke up, and I wasn't. I went in and out of my awareness of what was going on. I remember as a kid I would buy the record mirror.
Oh yeah.
When it was an inky, you know, it was
Yeah.
a tabloid inky, and I would like cut out things like, so I'd a double page interview with Richard Jobson on my bedroom wall, and so I knew a bit about the band, and I sort of don't think I was entirely aware of them breaking up, and then I was watching Top of the Pops, maybe like reading something, half paying attention because it was the early 80s and everything was new romantics and synth pop.
That's right. You had all the new pop at that point, didn't you?
And then I heard the DJ say, and next up we have Stuart Adamson's band. And, you know, I just responded, like, wait, what? And this noise started, and it was Fields of Fire. And again, it was like, well, I hadn't heard this guitar sound for a couple of years. And I didn't know that Stuart Adamson had a new project. And it was just kind of energising.
Yeah.
And people have written a lot about this sort of reinvention of the guitar in the early 80s. You know, obviously they talk about U2, but I think Big Country, what Stuart Adamson did, that they talked about the skirl, you know, that sort of bringing in this sound that evoked the bagpipes.
Yeah.
There was nothing quite like it. It was so exciting. And the album itself, though, had so many facets to it. You know, the critics got sniffy on the second album because basically they haven't reinvented the guitar a second time, you know. Whereas they'd created a sound.
Quite.
But what I love about the album was that there's so much to it. There's the sort of sweep and majesty of it, but then the sort of quieter moments, and then the epic songs at the end of each side. It was back in the day when bands really paid attention to what was the last track on each side. You know, so if side one ends with a storm, and you think, God, that was epic, but then side two ends with Poro Man, which is just one of the best pieces of music any Scottish band has recorded.
I think also Poro Man especially reminds you of the fact that Stuart Adamson was such an incredible guitarist and frontman, but, you know, night hangs on the city like a blanket on a cage. What a line. I mean, that's a book in itself, right?
I mean, he never wrote very directly about himself.
Yeah.
He didn't put himself front and centre. And his songwriting was always quite... it was illusory, and it didn't it let you fill in a lot of the blanks. It was about imagery or phrases. Yeah, that line, all of that, you know, give us iron, give us rope.
Yeah.
You know, it was you're invited to fill in what he was alluding to. You know, and no, I think he was a great lyricist, but the sort of scape that was conjured up by that music, and then there's the fact of going to see them live back then.
Did you go and see them? Have you seen them a few times?
Yeah, it was. I remember I was just slightly too late and too young to go to the Barrowland the first time when they were playing in about 83. So the next time they played was I think late 84 or was it 85? But it was at the Apollo, and it was of course huge and rammed and absolutely mental. And just everything that as a teenager you were hoping it would be. And I saw them at the Barrowland a few times. Saw them in summer '86 at the Barrowland, supported by Balaam and the Angel.
Oh wow! Okay.
And that's, I absolutely fell in love with them as well. and still, I'm actually going to see them in November.
Lifelong love.
But weirdly, it was one of the things my wife, Marissa Hatesman, who is lurking in the record shop.
Marissa's filing through the crates.
It was
as
one of the
we
things
speak.
we
I can tell you from here that Marissa's down in the female solo section.
appropriately.
I know it well.
and we bonded over Big Country.
Oh, really?
Because
Okay.
she was a huge fan, and it turned out we'd been to the same gig at the Apollo, you know, and they were, I think, both our favourite band, and so we traded stories about it, and we would listen to Big Country all the time.
And that's the thing as well, with a record like that, every song on it will take you back to a different place, and starting with In a Big Country, I mean, it's just such a manifesto, isn't it, to come out. It's so epic. It's everything encapsulated into minutes.
There's so many facets of Scotland in there.
Yeah.
And it's a song that endures. I mean, I've heard covers of it. There was a cover of it. It's not released somewhere. I just had to kind of rip it off of YouTube by Dashboard Confessional.
Really? Dashboard? Oh, I didn't know they did it.
Confusing them with Gaslight Anthem. No, Dashboard Confessional. No, they just did it on some American music show, so it's not released. So they did a cover of it, but then the Eddie Reader cover of it, which... I mean, I'm sort of filling up just thinking about it. And it plays over the end of the Alan Warner adaptation, Our Ladies, and you can't get through that without crying.
No, I've got shivers even thinking about it.
And then this year at the Celtic Connections, Eddie Reader did it with the symphony orchestra, all of that. Again, I was in floods.
There is something about it. There's something about Big Country, and particularly that album, because it was their calling card, I think, that does encapsulate that. It's so huge, it's bombastic, it's so anthemic, but it's kind of heartbreaking as well. And then you have something like Chance, and that's it, Floored. And again, it's not ostensibly a love song. You know, when you talk about heartbreaking music, you're thinking, oh, it's a tearjerker. That's not what this is. And the kind of industry and the landscape is so bound into the music and the words.
Industry especially, I mean, and the sort of working class experience. And with Chance especially, because Stuart Addison writes a lot of songs that sort of evoke a sort of male experience, but Chance is all about a woman, and it's like a short story.
Yeah, exactly.
But again, it's like a kind of short story that you're invited to fill in the blanks yourself.
It's so true.
Yeah.
When you're writing, thinking about the landscape of Big Country on the crossing, and of course Steel Town just encapsulates that in a title alone, do you use music to help conjure particular moods or times? I'm thinking again with something like The Cracked Mirror, I can envisage the music you'd have on for the 80s hard-boiled LA cop, and likewise this cottage atmosphere. Is that something you use? Do you have a sort of like a few tricks, if you like, to galvanise yourself into particular worlds?
I don't listen to music while I'm writing, but certainly there'll be things I've listened to will feed into what I'm creating, and it's an emotion. Sometimes it's not necessarily what the lyrics describe. Sometimes it's a feeling that it just evokes how a character might be feeling at that point. But it was maybe more explicit with some books than others, and I guess the character of Johnny Hawk, I was thinking of kind of bombastic 80s stuff, whether it would be I think I had an early draft where there's some woman he's ends up in bed with, and she's got a Cinderella t-shirt. I think I took that out.
I love to know it's there somewhere, though. These things
but
are
Johnny's
important.
catchphrase, or not so much a catchphrase, the thing he says all the time is "Holly golly." You know, when he says something, or he realises something surprising, and that's a deliberate reference to the Cramps. To "Can Your Pussy Do the Dog?" Because I thought there's a sort of slight sleaziness that I like about the world I was creating with Johnny. So,
and that's utterly it, isn't it? It's that aesthetic as well that the Cramps. I know there's a Brown Spotify playlist that you've created to kind of go along with the book, and there's I was delighted to see plenty of Cramps in there. So again, it's that kind of evocation. Okay, so we've got The Crossing. You've played as a record. We've had a chat about it. We've maybe played it a few times. So we're going to settle down for a movie. First of all, before we hear the movie, are you giving us any snacks?
Any snacks? Oh, almost certainly. And we'd probably be in my dining room because it's slightly warmer, and I've got the hi-fi set up in the kitchen that sort of plays into there. I've got a terribly cold kitchen.
Really?
Yeah. I'd probably put some guacamole together.
Together? That doesn't sound like you're even scooping it out of a dish. That sounds like you're making it. Are you a handmade guacamole?
Guacamole's not a hard thing to make.
I've never tried, so I couldn't tell you. That's me shamed. Anyway, we're going to put on a movie. Now, any time I ever even think about the film that we're watching, I'm going to remember watching it on a VHS up at my dad's house when you could get it out of the video shop, which was rare, and this was a good few years later. But what are we watching it on? You got a home hi-fi movie system?
No, just actually, it would be a Blu-ray, I think, rather than streaming, so that it doesn't break up or whatever. And actually, if I had, Marissa kind of basically, I had a massive speakers and a hi-fi connect to the telly, and she would never let me turn it on. So, but maybe I would have that set up just for this movie, because the soundtrack's very important to this movie.
Quite exactly. When did you tell us what it is, and also when did you first see it? Did you go to the pictures to see it?
The movie is Highlander from late summer 86.
Yeah.
And I first knew about it because I knew that Queen had done the soundtrack, and I was a massive fan of Queen. Absolutely. And Flash Gordon, how much their music contributed to the camp feel. Flash Gordon was just the perfect marriage of band and tone for a movie. And I knew they'd done music for this film, but I didn't know much about the film. It wasn't as easy in those days to find out about a film. You'd be lucky if you saw the trailer, and I didn't see the trailer. But I knew they had done songs for this film, but the songs hadn't come out yet either. And I think maybe the album came out, I can't remember. What I do remember is I was thinking, I'm really keen to see this. And then, of all things, there was a free preview screening on a Sunday morning.
Really?
So Marissa and I went to the ABC on Sauchiehall Street, and it was a Sunday morning, or maybe it was a weekday morning, but we got in for free, and it was the biggest screen as well, and that first it starts with Sean Connery doing the voiceover, then the first bars of Princes of the Universe come in, and from then on it was magnificently stupid, hugely entertaining, but and so strange. You think it's a film in which the Highlander, the eponymous Highlander, is played by actually an American, but who is of sort of French extraction and French provenance. Not the only, but the main Scottish person in it is playing an Egyptian who's been a naturalised Spaniard for centuries.
Yeah, exactly.
It's this clash of the accents is all over the place. It's a mental storyline, but it's just so entertaining.
I mean, you've certainly chosen an epic again, let's say that, at the very least. Okay, this is just utterly bombastic, sweeping the centuries and the universes, sci-fi, history.
The genres, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This is it. I mean, we're talking about the cracked mirror. I like playing with genre.
Quite.
Highlander, I mean, how would you depict what genre it is? Is it sci-fi, fantasy, historical, cop thriller?
Yes, it's all of those.
Because there's a modern-day New York detective story in there as well.
Yeah. It's all of those things. And interestingly, I watched it again last night because it's been a while just to remind myself. And it was so clear that Rob Roy, it was a precursor for that, for Braveheart.
Yeah.
And clearly for Outlander as well.
Yeah.
Even though at the time it did have a strange misperception. I don't think anyone quite knew what to make of it and to make of these characters and the accents. But you have to just suspend your disbelief and go with it.
I think also at the time we were quite starved of representations of Scotland.
Yeah.
Which is why we were so forgiving of how stupid it was. Because at the time we all went to see, in my age group, we all went to see Gregory's Girl, a dozen times because it was young people in Scotland. And we went to see some really mediocre films as long as they had any Scottish connection. And there was nothing that had that sweep. No. So when Highlander came along, it was like, this is Hollywood doing something Scottish. Quite. And I think we got so excited because the other thing you got about Scottish depictions were it was something really grim and hyper-realistic. So this big escapist Hollywood sci-fi fantasy mashup, but it was Scotland. Yeah. And it made the landscape look beautiful. And I remember I went to see it so many times. And because it ran for so long, it kept running in one of the sort of smaller screens in the ABC for about 6 months.
Wow.
And so it was nights I would be like coming home from university at the library. I'd had a hard day, and I'd realised that I could still make a screening at 9 o'clock and get back for the last train, and I'd go and see it again.
That's absolutely lovely. It does have all of those aspects, but you touched on the musical element as well. I was a huge Queen fan at this point as well, by the way. And that album, A Kind of Magic, which has got the songs from the film on it, I just still adore. They work as their own songs, but within kind of woven into the film, they're just brilliant. But the other thing is that the director, Russell Mulcahy, I think his name is, so he'd made these music videos for like Duran Duran, Planet Earth, Bonnie Tyler, Total Eclipse of the Heart.
I think he did the Wild Boys video as well.
And Vienna by Ultravox. And I can't help thinking all of those things actually were a bit of a precursor to Highlander, never mind what came later. You can see all of those touchstones, the sci-fi, the drama, this epic sweep of them. It's all there.
Swords and costumes.
Exactly. You can see why he was kind of approached to come up with this wild world. The other thing is that it's split between worlds. So ostensibly we're in kind of 16th century Scottish Highlands and as you say, the sort of like 1980s, slightly futuristic feeling New York. There's a kind of Ridley Scott feel about it as well,
there's a lot of like steam from vents and great lighting, a lot of blue light. And the irony is, it was all shot in London. Yeah,
quite exactly. I know. It is convincing, isn't it? Well, within the realms of the effects that we had at the time.
Very few shots were done in New York. Most of it was shot in London.
Yeah, exactly. But again, it's very much that aspect of being within different worlds and taking the viewer or the reader with you. And I think that's something that we've really, really embraced with The Cracked Mirror, is living in two different places and inhabiting two different characters, if you like, at the same time. It's possible.
That's a good point. Maybe it's like enjoying something like Highlander down the years made me feel comfortable that you can mash things together and things that don't belong together. When you put them together, you get a dynamic, you get an excitement, and you get a friction.
Quite,
rather than think, you can't take this genre and blend it with another.
I do think there's something in that. And it's also having faith in the audience.
Yeah.
Right?
That they want to see the genres clash together.
Yeah.
They will go with you as long as you're telling an engaging story. You know, like with Highlander, those opening moments, there's this great, clever transitions between warriors in the 16th century and then like wrestling fans at,
the wrestlers.
Madison Square Garden. You know, it's full of these great transitions because I think I read there's a really good book about making the film, and they were saying they realised they had these transitions were going to be really important to help bring people along with it. So the visuals were fantastic, just to blend you from one era to another.
But you can do that on screen. That's a trickier.
Do you know, it was more of a challenge for me in that I keep making a joke when I'm promoting the book, saying that when you first read Johnny Hawk, you might think there's been a binding error with the book because you've read 3 chapters about this cosy Persia village, and suddenly you're in LA in a car chase. And I had someone tell me that they'd read, to use the phrase, the book on audio book, and they were out running. And they started listening. They're really enjoying this, and then they thought that their iPhone had malfunctioned because suddenly the next chapter, it's all the corpse in the confessional. And then suddenly the next chapter, it's an American accent. Someone saying, "Everybody dies alone," chapter 1, and this person thinking, "Wait, what's that?"
What's happened? There's been a glitch, and there has indeed. But the point is, we go with the glitch in the kind of the universe, wherever it is, and whatever time and place it's taking us to. But it is that idea of going, we can all go along with this. It's all right, and I do love that aspect of it. Okay, so we've watched the movie, we've seen Highlander. Just finally, I love that there's a line in it that I had forgotten about, and it just, again, you go, you can take this anywhere you like. Most people are afraid to die. You're afraid to live.
Yes.
It's like, it's delivered in such a profound way. You go, is this the heart of it, really? Maybe it is. Maybe that's what it's about.
It's, in a way, it's because it's a film about immortals.
Quite.
That there's a certain irony in that that MacLeod is afraid to live, and that he's afraid to commit to a woman, for instance, because he's experienced the pain of losing one. And it's interesting because actually Richard Dawkins in I think it's in The God Delusion, talks about the fact that if a race of creatures were immortal, they would have terrible lives because they would be the stakes of doing anything with any risk, because you'd so much to lose, would be so high that you wouldn't do anything. You wouldn't cross the road.
And that's exactly that.
And that's it. So I guess that encapsulated it. Highlander pre-echoed or anticipated Richard Dawkins by about 20 or 30 years.
I knew it was that important. I knew I was a fan of that film as well. Okay, so we've had that on the Blu-ray or the VHS. We used to watch it at my dad's. He had one of these TVs that was on a little trolley, so sometimes we could wheel the VHS into the bedroom and watch Highlander. Very, very exciting. Probably slightly too young, but that's all the best films are. Okay, so we've watched our movie. We've had our homemade Chris Brookmyre special guacamole.
Yeah.
And so we're going to have some bedtime reading. Yeah. So you've chosen another epic, and also something else that is rooted in music.
Yeah, and weirdly to say it's an epic, it's a surprisingly short book.
Quite.
It's Espadare Street by Ian Banks, which is just one of the best books about rock and roll you could ever read. It's one of the funniest books I've ever read.
Yeah.
And it's, again, it takes a sense of Scottishness. I think I owe a lot to Ian Banks. I remember when I first read The Wasp Factory, I was out in the garden, and I think it was like summer holidays at university, and I able to read stuff just for pleasure.
Oh, yeah.
I remember almost falling off my chair laughing at stuff in The Wasp Factory, then being horrified by equal measure. But what really inspired me about him was I realised I had a similar sense of humour, a similar perspective when I thought up stories. It was this kind of weird, dark combination of the horrific and the funny. And seeing that someone could do this and get it published, and that was very inspiring. But then came Espadare Street, and I owe this book such a debt. My story of reading it the first time, I started it in the morning of a Friday when I was working in London. I was going home back to Glasgow to see Marissa, and so I started reading it on the Underground, did my day's work, went straight from work to Euston. It was one of the hottest days on record, apparently. Wow. So the train tracks expanded, which caused real problems at Euston.
Jeez.
The train was there for an hour late in leaving the station. It ran out of drink before it even left Euston, because it was old rolling stock. There was no air conditioning unless it was just basically windows if the train wasn't moving. So everyone was just sweating buckets, and would have been the most horrific journey. We get to Glasgow Central. I'm sitting there. I realise I'm totally drenched in sweat, but I've finished Espadare Street, and everyone else looks exhausted and deadbeat. And I'd spent the entire journey transported on this voyage with Weird, as he calls himself, the bass player in Frozen Gold. And it was just everything that I wanted a book to be. It was the characterisation was so warm and funny. It's about someone who wants to kill themselves and then realises life's worth living. So it's sort of redemptive. It gets music, and what music meant at that time. Evoked a kind of Frozen Gold seemed like a kind of Scottish Fleetwood Mac or something like that.
Yeah.
Very
kind of
quite proggy.
Totally.
And the tensions within the band and all of that. But it's conveyed in about 75,000 words.
Yeah.
It's a short book, but it's got so many facets to it.
Yeah. That's so true. It is. It's deceptively short. I love that we've got this fly buzzing around us, and don't know what time of year this is. I know. I feel like it's like some sort of Highlanders thing. It's going to morph into something else in a minute, a vulture or something. Anyway, the flies around. But yeah, Frozen Gold.
Flies, the cramps again.
Everything's connected. The idea of this band. I also imagine them being a bit prog rock, and of course, again, since then, even within Scottish literature, there have been great other books about imaginary bands. Alan Warner, you mentioned earlier, Kitchenley 434, Kirsten Innes's Scabby Queen, David Keenan's This Is Memorial Device. But to go back then, having read all of them since I last read Espadare Street, to revisit it, I think I had forgotten the warmth and the humour. That fly is not going to leave us alone. But what I also had kind of forgotten was that there's loss and there's hope and there's, there's that feeling of never fitting in. Yeah,
I think what's ingenious is that a lot of books and stories about bands are about the cool people.
Yeah.
But he makes it often the point of view of Danny Weir, who is awkward. He's from Figgy Park in Paisley, so he's from an impoverished background. He doesn't fit in. He imagines that he'll just write the songs and sit in the background. And it's appropriate he becomes the bass player, because bass players do like to lurk a wee bit. And he's so compelling that way. You just want to hug Danny the whole time.
That's so true. Yeah.
But he's got all this depth to him, and also the fact that he doesn't tell certain people that he's a rock star, and they don't know, and that's brilliant. There's this. It's so funny, but also so kind of very relatable that he has this weird coterie of unlikely friends in Glasgow, and he lives in this folly.
Yeah.
And goes out drinking with people who don't know he's a star. And part of you as a reader, you want them to know he's a star. You want them to know all that he's achieved. But it's brilliant in how that's revealed, is that he finally reveals it to his drinking buddy, because otherwise they're going to get beaten up.
Yeah, that's the only reason. It's under complete duress. They've trashed a restaurant, and he suddenly, the only way to get it is he brings out his Platinum Amex card. I know, it's so true. It's also, I realised when I revisited it, it's a book about guilt. There's a great bit early on where Weird is kind of reflecting and says, feeling guilty was the constant baseline to my life. It was part of the fabric of reality. It was the most natural thing in the world. To live was to feel, oh God, what have I done? The big G. It resonates throughout it, but I wonder if also part of that is part of our love for not just fiction, but particularly in Scotland, crime writing, because that essence of guilt is so relatable to so many of us.
Yeah, well, I think it's also with that. I don't know if it's a sort of ordinary Scottish thing where we just feel that everything's our fault.
Yes,
slash responsibility.
Exactly that. Yeah, I do.
So we're always looking for our own culpability in the wider picture. And Ian was never considered a crime writer, but he actually wrote what are great crime novels. I mean, Complicity, the classic Scottish crime novel. Yeah. And I think one of the great Scottish crime novels is The Crow Road.
Oh, absolutely.
And it wasn't marketed as such, but it's just one of Ian's best. It's one I come back to all the time. But Ian, he wrote so many amazing novels, the science fiction as well, but a kind of sense of the music ran through everything he wrote.
It did. That's so true. And he made music as well. And it did. I love that Frozen Gold. I can kind of half imagine what they sound like. And
yeah, I think we all have a sense of what they would sound like. Although I would have a kind of proggy sense, but weirdly for me, the song that always popped into my head when I would think of Espadare Street probably wouldn't have sounded like them at all, but was Prospect Street by the Big Dish. Just because I was listening to them a lot during the 80s, obviously, and just that would pop into my head when I thought of Espadare Street. But I think also because I knew Espadare Street. I mean, I'm from Barrhead, and I would go into Paisley, and there was a good chippy on Espadare Street. And my dad rewired houses in Espadare Street, and it stayed with me. It's one of those books I'll come back to it every few years and reread it because it's very comforting.
Yeah. I do love that if you know a place, if it's a familiar street or locale, you do bring in all of your own experiences to that. So the chippy and your dad rewiring the houses, you know, the landscape of that's just a bit more familiar, which is lovely.
And people would say that to me then once I was published, they'd say they kept coming back to books, or they enjoyed the fact that it was places they knew and places they could relate to. Yeah, quite exactly. There's such a playfulness in the book as well. There's a bit where he's talking about, I think it's when he first sees Christine, weird this is, and he says, Jesus, what a smile. I was left metaphorless before the warmth of a small, shy grin. Yeah.
There's having fun within the books, and again, that's something that you do so often, whether it's catching sight of characters within different worlds, within different books, or something like The Cracked Mirror, where you're utterly setting these characters up to eventually come together.
Yeah, he's brilliant at, and Espadare Street's a great example of conveying the sort of the difference between how people initially perceive characters and then once they get a bit further beneath the skin. So with something like The Cracked Mirror, I can go deep on that because it's two very opposed individuals, and so it becomes about them becoming, not just coming to like each other, but becoming more like each other, and recognising that the thing that's missing in themselves is actually the thing that annoyed them at first about the other person. And that's crucial. And that warmth, that realisation that there's so much complexity to someone, and Ian conveyed that brilliantly in Espadare Street, the fact that when he first perceives Christine, he'll also think that she's obviously this kind of, for one thing, he assumes she's more sexually experienced. Yeah. And it becomes clear because he just assumes everybody's more sexually experienced than him. And that vulnerability that he perceives, and there's just so much to it.
Yeah, I think that's so true. Again, reading it, knowing that I was coming to speak to you about it, and revisiting it, which was a great excuse to do so, so thank you. There's an Ambrose in it. There's an Ambrose Wykes, or Wicks is a tobacco merchant, which got me thinking, how did the name Ambrose Parry come about? So this is, Marissa has, she's gone through to the front, she's in the CD section.
No, she's actually
is she in the bottom?
Down looking at a row of low positioned
low-lying
albums.
12 inches. Okay.
It was Marissa came up with the name, and it was the first, when she did her Masters in the History of Medicine, the first tutorial she did was on this French 16th century military surgeon called Ambroise Paré.
Okay.
And he was someone who he described an obstetrics manoeuvre that appeared in the first novel, and he translated medical textbooks from Latin into French so that they were more accessible. And he's a big hero of medicine in France. But she liked the name, she anglicised the name and said, when we started talking about this, she said, how about Ambrose Parry as a pseudonym? And I thought it was a great idea because it evoked a different era. Yeah. It's also kind of, I know Ambrose is a male name, but it's still kind of ambiguous.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's so true. But it did get me thinking about the difference between being a solo artist and being in a band. We reflect on both of those aspects within Espadare Street, but also with being a solo writer and having a collaboration, because that's a whole different dynamic, and it is a bit more like, and of course you play in a band as well, a fun-loving crime writer, so you've got all three, right? You've got the duo, you've got the solo, the duo, and the band.
Yeah, I get to have my solo side projects.
They're doing okay, I think. I think we can safely say this weekend of all weekends.
And what's been great actually for me is that the collaboration has completely transformed my solo writing.
Quite, yeah.
I would never have embarked upon The Cracked Mirror if it wasn't for Ambrose Parry, because working with Marissa altered how I approach everything, not just the extent to which I'm planning things more, and we plan things in depth in a way that I didn't do in the past in order that we can then divide the writing labour. But just the sense of control, or the sense of knowing where the story's going, is quite empowering, and I wouldn't have been able to embark on something as ambitious as the Cracked Mirror if it wasn't that A, I'd learned to plan more, and B, I had someone to plan with.
Yeah.
So we planned it out in over the course of a week. We did a kind of working holiday, and we did it all, and Marissa taking lots of notes and me outlining things and her saying whether it made sense or not, and that was conceptual, and then some of it was plot related. But it meant after a week we had a plan that made me feel so much more confident in what I could then do with the characters and bringing it to life. So there's a massively collaborative component to the Cracked Mirror. That said, Marissa did remark again and again that she's very grateful she didn't actually have to do any of the writing because, pulling this one together, it's all very well having a big whiteboard with lots of post-it notes on it. It's a whole other thing.
Oh my goodness, but it's trusting. It is so much work, but it is a little bit of trusting the magic of it as well. And I think that goes for putting on an album and knowing that the songs are going to work in the order they're in, or that these crazy realms in Highlander where you've got the 16th century Scotland and the 80s New York, or the Cracked Mirror and these characters and their different worlds. If you can just pull it together and have faith in the reader, the audience, but also in yourself to go, this can work. It's possible, right? And that is magic.
Yeah, that is a kind of magic. You draw upon, I guess, as a writer, you're drawing upon things that had an influence on you 30 or 40 years before. You don't realise that, the way in which it's manifesting.
Yeah.
I'm only realising some of it with regards to Highlander now, that kind of film would have had an effect on what I thought you could do while telling a story.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I wasn't as restricted in my perception of what the rules were. And something like Espadare Street, I realised that everything I know, or everything that prepared me about being in a band or working with other people, would have come from Espadare Street, because he wrote about those dynamics so well, and convincingly, because you can read lots of stuff about bands having arguments, and I've written about bands in a few books. Big Boy did it and ran away, and then most recently in The Cliff House, because that was partly about two members of a band who have not spoken to each other for a very long time because one went solo, but I think it was the way in which Ian depicted it with. So you understood where these tensions came from, but you saw all the pain and vulnerability behind it. And the sense of loss and affection that underpinned it. And that, I think, ran through every depiction of a band that I've written. But it prepared me for collaboration. Yeah, exactly. And of course, the final pages of Espadare Street, they're full of hope as well, right? Well, I have to have a redemptive story. I get described as being part of tartan noir, and I get that it's a convenient and it's a handy term, but I never really embrace that my work is noir, because I think my work is always optimistic. Quite. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Well, listen, on that note, shall we go and see how many copies of Big Country's The Crossing we can find in Europa Music? Can we find a red one, a blue one and a green one? And are we going to fight over all the records in the Loot section, Chris Brookmyre? I think you can have the Loot albums. Thank you so much. I'll get the comedy, you get the Loot albums. All right, okay, and let's find out what Marissa's been raking up while we've been chatting. Thank you so much. It was really lovely to chat. It's been a pleasure, Nicola. Cheers.